The frost had not yet lifted when Silas Greeley stepped barefoot into the snow, carrying a patchwork quilt stitched before his birth. Long before the snow came heavy that winter, the prairie had gone quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get after a storm, but the deeper kind, like the land had taken a breath it wasn't sure it wanted to exhale. The cattle barely moved. Fence posts leaned harder each day as if they, too, were weary. And in the low morning light, the Greeley house stood as it always had, gray, square, and stoic, framed by a crooked split-rail fence and frost-hardened fields that stretched all the way to Widow's Ridge. Inside, the fire still burned from the night before. Nettie Greeley stirred embers with the ash stick, the same one her father had carved when she was a girl. She did not speak as Silas passed her, the quilt clutched in his arms, his feet bare against the cold-planked floor. She only looked up once, briefly. Her eyes soft and unreadable. Then she went back to stirring, and Silas slipped out the front door without a word. The quilt was heavy in his arms, patches of old calico, tobacco-stained linen, and a square or two cut from the faded shirt of a sister he'd never known, lost before he was born. One corner of it had been chewed through by the old hound dog years ago. Still it held warmth. That morning, it was all he could think to bring. His feet met the snow like they belonged there. It didn't hurt. At least not yet. The cold was different that morning. It moved like something alive, something watching. The barn stood far enough from the house to offer privacy, nestled in the crook where the back field met the scrubland. The boards were warped. The roof sagged a little where lightning had struck it 2 summers prior. It had once been red. Now it was the color of sorrow. Wind pushed through the wheat stubble in dry hisses. Silas's breath came in short bursts, disappearing into the morning air before he could see its shape. As he walked, the hem of his nightshirt stuck to his knees. He should have worn boots. He should have said something, but something in his chest had told him not to. Not yet. The first time he saw her, he thought she was part of the fence, some slumped, forgotten thing left to rot where the land quit caring. She was crumpled near the far gate, half covered by a patch of snow that hadn't melted yet. Her skin was the color of ash. Her braid lay across her back, streaked with dried blood and earth, and her feet, bare and bruised, were curled in on themselves like fists. He stopped 10 paces away. His heart didn't speed up. It didn't drop. It just hung there, waiting. The crows above shifted on the fence rails but didn't fly. One of them croaked, sharp and angry, but the woman didn't move. Her chest rose. Not much, but enough. Silas stepped forward, slow. The quilt unfolded in his hands. It dragged the snow with it as he knelt beside her. Up close, she didn't look like anything he understood. Her dress was buckskin, soaked through and frozen at the edges. Her wrists bore bruises, some old, some fresh. One hand gripped a small pouch beaded in red and blue, and she held it like it was breath itself. "I brought this," he said, laying the quilt over her shoulders. She flinched, then stilled. Her eyes opened, not wide, not with panic, but slow, as though waking from someplace far off. They were dark, too dark to see through, and they locked on him like a question he couldn't answer. You understand me?" he whispered. No answer, but her gaze stayed. He tucked the quilt around her, careful not to touch more than he needed. She didn't blink, didn't speak, but something in her body shifted, not toward him, but not away either. He stood, looked back toward the house. The windows were orange with firelight. Abram would be shaving by now, spitting into the tin. Nettie would have started the biscuits. They wouldn't miss him for a few minutes. "I'll come back," he said, though he wasn't sure she'd heard him. The walk back was heavier. Snow clung to his soles. His toes stung. Inside the house, no one asked where he'd been. Abram nodded toward the stove. "Your tea's gone cold. Silas drank it anyway. Supper that night was cornbread and pork fat. No one said much. Abram cleaned his rifle twice. Nettie stitched in silence. Silas ate with one hand in his lap, fingers curling and uncurling, remembering the feel of frozen cloth, cracked skin, breath so faint it didn't stir the air. That night, he dreamt of blue beads scattered across snow, of breathing that came in gasps, and the smell of smoke clinging to feathers. He woke before dawn. The sky was low and colorless. He dressed in silence, boots this time, and took a biscuit from the larder. The tin cup went into his coat pocket, filled with water from the pump. She was still there. She hadn't moved much, but the quilt steamed slightly. Her eyes opened when he approached. This time she blinked. "I brought something," he said. He knelt, offered the biscuit. Her fingers moved slowly. She broke off a piece, ate it without looking away from him, then reached for the tin. "You got a name?" he asked. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she pointed to her chest. Her voice cracked like dry bark. "Asha." He said it back, unsure. She smiled, just barely, then coughed, dark blood blooming in the quilt. "Don't die," he muttered, almost angrily. She looked past him, toward the barn. He helped her up. She winced, but didn't resist. Inside, the barn smelled of horses and old hay. He cleared a stall, laid down fresh straw, folded the quilt around her again. She curled up like a small animal, her eyes closed, not from weakness, but something close to trust. He watched her a while, then slipped out through the side door. Back at the house, Abram stood at the fence, fingers running along the wire. "You see them tracks yesterday?" Silas nodded. "You tell me if you see more." He nodded again, but said nothing about what he'd already seen. That night the wind howled hard and mean, but the dogs didn't bark, not once. Silas lay in bed, blanket tucked tight, staring at the ceiling. Something inside him had changed shape. Not pain, not fear. Something older. Something that didn't have a name yet. He rose just before midnight, crept to the window. The stars looked sharper than usual. The ridge, black against the sky, seemed taller, still, watching. Then he saw them. Not riders, not torches, just shapes, unmoving. Dark figures atop horses, spaced out like stones along a river. The barn was lit, just faintly, a single candle. He pulled on his coat, boots crunching against the floorboards, and stepped out. The air hit like a slap. The snow had thickened. He moved low, past the chicken shed, to the barn. The door stood ajar. She sat upright now, awake, hair loose down her back. Her eyes were different. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly. "You shouldn't be alive," he replied. Something passed between them, wordless, weightless. She reached into the pouch, pulled out a carved figure, a horse, or maybe a buffalo. She pressed it into his hand. "You saw me," she said. "No one does." He stared at it. A breeze stirred. The horses in the stalls shifted. The candle flickered. She turned her head sharply toward the east window. "What is it?" he asked. She didn't answer, but outside, on the ridge, something moved. He crossed to the window, dark against darker. Figures. Still. "Do they want you?" She didn't move. "They want to see." "See what?" She looked at him, not like a boy, but like a question. "That you gave me the blanket," she said. He swallowed. "I just did what felt right. That's what they're afraid of." He didn't know who they were. Not yet, but he would. Outside, more shapes joined the ridge, more horses, more shadows. No movement, just presence. And inside that old barn, under a low roof that creaked with memory, Silas Greeley stood next to a woman who should have died, and felt something inside him tighten, like a string pulled taut by something older than history. She blinked once, slow, then whispered, "You saw me." And Silas understood, without knowing how, that the world had just changed its shape. The wind blew wrong again the next night, not fast, but flat, like it had somewhere to be, and no warmth left to give. Sometimes, when the prairie wind goes flat like that, the old ones used to say it was because something had arrived, not coming, not passing, but already here, waiting. The wind itself held its breath, and the world leaned in to listen. Silas Greeley felt that hush in his ribs before he saw it with his eyes. It was the kind of stillness that made your boots feel too loud, and your heartbeat sound like it belonged to someone else. The frost held over from the day before. Sunlight never quite broke the clouds. It just hovered there, colorless and without promise. At the breakfast table, Abram mentioned broken fence wire again. Nettie poured coffee into thick ceramic mugs without a word. No one talked about the way the dogs refused to cross the backyard, or how the barn door creaked even when the wind was dead still. Silas kept his eyes low, his thoughts lower. Asha Redbird, the name she'd offered, hadn't said much more. But her silence spoke in other ways. The way her shoulders relaxed slightly when she saw him. The way she no longer clutched the pouch to her chest, quite so tight. She had eaten only half the biscuit he brought yesterday, and drank from the tin cup like it might vanish between swallows. Every movement she made still came from pain, but less so now. Her hands trembled less. Her eyes didn't dart as much. The barn had become something else, a threshold between the world he knew and one that seemed pulled from a forgotten legend. That morning, he brought her a strip of salt pork wrapped in brown paper and a second quilt, smaller than the first, woven in blue tones that had belonged to his aunt, now dead 8 winters. He didn't ask permission. When he opened the barn door, the air inside was warmer than he expected. The horses were still, though one snorted at his arrival. She was sitting up in the straw, her back against the stall wall. The beaded pouch lay on the ground beside her, no longer hidden, its colors dull in the low light. She looked at him, not quite welcoming, but no longer guarded. "You're not gone," she said. "No," he answered. "Didn't plan to be." She accepted the salt pork, but didn't eat right away. Her fingers played along the edge of the paper like it was something sacred. Silas leaned against the post, his boots pressing lines into the straw. "You speak more today," he said after a while. She nodded slightly. "My throat, less dying." He smiled at that, though it faded fast. She ate slowly, no haste, no thanks, just deliberate bites as if she needed to remember how. Outside, a crow called out, then another answered, farther away. The horses shifted. "You got family?" Silas asked, quieter now. She didn't look at him but gave a small nod. "I don't ask where," he added. Another silence stretched between them. This one didn't feel heavy, just unspoken. "They think I'm dead," she said at last, "or lost. It don't matter much." "I think it does," Silas said, and was surprised by how sure he sounded. She finished chewing, wiped her mouth with the edge of her sleeve, and said, "My name was meant to be forgotten." He opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. The moment didn't need fixing. It needed witnessing. When she coughed again around noon, it shook her body in one hard pull. Silas moved quickly, a reflex now, catching her by the shoulders. The quilt slipped, revealing the bruises across her ribs. Some faded to yellow, others still a deep, angry purple. He froze. "I didn't mean to see," he whispered. "But you did," she rasped, pulling the blanket back up. "And you won't tell." He didn't. She leaned against the wall again, eyes closed. "I won't tell," he said. "Not 'cause I'm scared, but 'cause they wouldn't care." "That's the right kind of silence," she said softly. and that was the end of it. Later, he built a small fire in the feed trough and wedged open the slats above to let the smoke out. It took effort, but the barn warmed just enough for her fingers to loosen. She held her hands to the flame and watched it like it might tell her something. The smoke clung to her hair. Her cheekbones stood out sharper in the light, but her eyes softened, just slightly. "You're not afraid of me," she said. Silas shook his head. "I'm afraid of a lot of things, but not you." She watched the flames, her face unreadable. "Even when I get strong." He tilted his head. "You planning to hurt me?" "No." "Then I'm still not afraid." That silence between them stretched again, but it had changed shape. No longer space, now a bond. The fire crackled. The horses quieted. The wind outside shifted, pulling a new cold through the boards, and then faintly, so faintly it could have been imagined, the sound of hoofbeats. Not fast, not close, but there. Silas moved to the barn door, opened it just enough to peer out. The prairie was still. The trees near the dry creek bed swayed, but no wind hit his face. Then he saw it. Far off, along the top of the ridge, dark figures, mounted, motionless, not men from town, not surveyors, not riders bringing mail, just shapes, watching. He stepped back, shut the door. She was singing now, soft, a low hum more than words, the kind of song made for lost children or dying stars. He didn't recognize the language, but the tune settled deep in his bones. "What does it mean?" he asked. She didn't look up. "It's for the dead and the lost." "You're not dead," he said. She paused. "Then maybe just lost." He sat beside her. The fire cast long shadows against the stall wall. Her voice continued, no longer for the dead, but for something else. Maybe for him. "You said your name yesterday. Asha. What does it mean?" Her eyes caught the firelight. "It means hope, or sky, depending on who you ask. My grandmother gave it to me." "That's pretty," he said. She was. They fell quiet again. The kind of quiet that holds more than sound, that holds trust. Night came heavy and quick. The stars above were nails in velvet, cold, sharp, eternal. When he left, he paused in the doorway, looked once more to the ridge. The shapes were still there, unmoving, watching, waiting. He returned to the house by way of the root cellar. Nettie was bent over the stove, stirring something that smelled like beans and old onions. Abram stood by the window, watching. Not speaking. "Something's coming," he muttered. Nettie glanced at him. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he said, "but the ridge don't look right." She didn't answer. That night, Silas stayed in bed longer than usual, but sleep didn't come easy. He kept thinking about her hands, the sound of her voice when she sang, the way her eyes had found peace for just one moment by the fire. Sometime past midnight, he heard something different. Not wind, not coyotes, voices, but not in English. He sat up. The dogs didn't bark. They were already silent. He grabbed the lantern, stepped outside. The barn stood still, not a light, not a sound. He pushed the door open. Inside, she stood, awake, on her own 2 feet, hair down, quilt slipping from one shoulder. "You're supposed to be resting," he said. Her breath fogged in the cold. "There are more," she whispered. He stepped closer. "More what?" She didn't answer right away. Then, "People. My people. They're not here for war." "Then what?" She turned to him, eyes dark and lit from within. "To see if you are like them, or different." "I'm not like them," he said, too quick. "You gave me your blanket," she said. "You looked cold." "That's not what they saw." She moved toward the barn door. "Asha," he said, unsure how he knew she was about to open it. She didn't look back. "You told me your name," she said. "I didn't." "You did. In the way you look when you hope." She pulled the door open, and far off, on the ridge, beneath the hard starlight, the watchers stood. And as the stars burned over Bridle Pass, Silas watched the ridge breathe, not in movement, but in memory. By mid-morning, the frost had grown teeth, and the church bell rang, not for service, but warning. There hadn't been a service in Bridle Pass for near 3 weeks. Pastor Jennings had gone east for a funeral and hadn't come back yet. And even if he had, most folks hadn't been interested in sitting through scripture when the ridge had grown a shadow. But this morning, when that bell rang from the spire atop the little clapboard church, every settler for 5 miles looked up from their chores and felt their skin pull tight. The ridge had been still for 2 full days now. Too still. Not a bird passed overhead. Not a single coyote's cry echoed at night. It was as if the land itself was waiting for something it couldn't. Silas Greeley stood behind the barn, axe in hand, pretending to split logs that didn't need splitting. His breath plumed in the cold, rising like a signal only the waiting ones might see. The barn door was cracked slightly behind him. He hadn't said it out loud, but something told him not to close it entirely. It wasn't fear. It wasn't caution either. It was something else. Like the barn needed to breathe, too. Inside, Asha Redbird had begun moving more. She was stronger now, her voice surer, her steps firmer. But something in her had hardened as well. She'd stopped humming, stopped telling him the meanings of words in her language. Her fingers tightened around the beaded pouch whenever he came near, though not in distrust, more like someone holding a relic that knew how the story ended. When she had looked out at the ridge that morning, her breath caught the light like steam from a dying fire. She didn't say what she saw, but Silas knew something had changed. In the distance, hooves clattered down the main trail, slow, heavy, one rider, not from the ridge, from the east. Townfolk stirred. Men emerged with rifles over shoulders. Women pulled children inside by the elbows. The sound of boots on porches echoed like hammers on wood. A figure approached on horseback, wrapped in wolfskin and shadow. The man rode like someone who didn't care if he was seen. Back straight, jaw clenched, every motion deliberate. His horse bore the marks of hard travel. Dust caked the man's boots and coat, but his eyes were clean, clear and sharp, set into a face weathered like river stone. He did not slow as he passed the livery, nor when he rode past Mrs. Gorman's general store, where the curtain twitched behind the glass. He headed straight for the Greeley homestead, as if the road had been carved from memory, not mapped by accident. Silas felt him before he saw him, heard the crunch of hooves, the subtle creak of leather. He turned the axe handle in his palm, knuckles whitening. From the barn, Asha stepped out. She saw him. She froze. And then she whispered one word. Him. The rider stopped just short of the fence. He dismounted slowly, dropping to the snow like it pained him more than he'd admit. He left his rifle slung across the saddle. He didn't need it. His presence was weapon enough. Abram Greeley stepped out onto the porch, rifle resting on one arm, eyes cold. "You got business here." "Stranger?" he called. The man didn't flinch. He looked past Abram, toward the barn. "I came for something that was taken," he said. From behind the half-shut barn door, Silas stepped out, placing himself between the man and Asha. He didn't say a word. The man's eyes flicked to the boy, then back to Asha. "You left without finishing," he said. "I wasn't yours to finish," she answered. His face twitched, just once. "You vanished after the treaty," he said. "I rode after the bruises. You rode because it was easier than staying. I never touched you in hate. You touched me in expectation," she said, and her voice cut sharper than cold steel. "That's a slower kind of death." The silence that followed felt like it could bend trees. Abram's voice cut in, rough and low. "This is settler land. You said your piece. Leave now." The man looked at him, not with anger, but with something colder, dismissal, and then he turned to Silas. "You gave her a blanket." Silas nodded. "I gave her warmth. She belonged to us." "No," Silas said, stepping forward. "She belonged to no one. And maybe that's why you lost her." Asha did not speak again. She stood behind them both, still as a statue, the wind catching her braid and carrying the scent of ash and winter. The man exhaled. His breath curled around his words, thick with old fire. "They'll come for her." "Let them," Asha said flatly. "But they'll find I'm no longer theirs. You'll bring war." She took a step forward. "No," she said. "You will, because you cannot stand to see a woman choose peace where she was meant to bleed." He stepped back, as if struck. His eyes flared, then dimmed. He turned, swung into the saddle, and rode east again, not looking back. No one spoke for a long while. Inside the barn, the candle still burned. The horses did not stir. Nettie came out onto the porch and placed a hand on Abram's shoulder. He didn't shake it off. Silas remained where he stood, eyes fixed on the edge of the woods where the rider had vanished. Later, while the sun fell low and the snow grew blue with dusk, Asha sat by the feed trough, staring at the fire Silas had coaxed back to life. Her face was unreadable, but not closed. He handed her another biscuit. She took it this time without ceremony. "They will talk," she said. "Let them," he replied. "They'll wonder what spell I cast." "I don't believe in spells." She looked at him, a question behind her eyes. "Then why help me?" He answered without hesitation. "Because you looked like someone who'd been seen last by wolves." She blinked once, then leaned her head against the stall post. For the first time, she did not pull away when his shoulder brushed hers. The man didn't draw a weapon. He just looked at Silas like he'd seen a ghost, then turned his horse east, away from the ridge, and back into the past. The ridge never moved, but when the wind fell still, even the snowflakes hovered like breath not yet exhaled. On the morning, Bridle Pass remembered how to hold its breath. Not a soul stirred without cause. The land had turned pale as bone overnight. The sky hung low, weighted with unshed snow, and the frost no longer crunched under boots. It whispered, like something about to confess. Inside the Greeley home, Abram stood by the window longer than usual, rifle leaning against the sill. Nettie moved quietly behind him, pouring coffee neither of them would finish. Silas sat at the table, untouched plate in front of him, eyes tracing the edge of the knife he'd used to spread butter the night before. No one spoke, not of the man who'd come, not of the ridge that hadn't moved in days, but all three of them looked toward the barn door more times than they would admit. From the ridge, they were still watching, and they had been, all through the night. 30, maybe 40 of them now, mounted figures, unmoving as trees but far too alive to be mistaken. No banners, no calls, just presence. Wakan Elk arrived just past mid-morning. His horse was pale and scarred. No war paint stained his skin. He wore a buffalo hide cloak with the dust of long roads on its fringe. His hair was streaked with gray, his eyes darker than any firelight. He rode alone, down the ridge like he had carved the trail himself with memory. He did not announce himself. He stopped at the gate. Abram stepped onto the porch, hands cold around the stock of the rifle. "You got business here, Chief?" he asked, sharp like flint. Wakan did not answer at first. He looked past Abram, toward the barn, toward something older than territory. "I was told," he said finally, voice like gravel in water, "that one of our blood lay dying on settler land, and that a boy gave her his only blanket." Abram's jaw tightened. "My son's been nowhere near your kind." Tall Elk's gaze did not flicker. Are you sure of that? Nettie came to the door, her apron wrung between her hands. If he did, she said gently, he did it out of pity. The old man turned his gaze on her. It was not pity, he said. It was honor. From behind the barn, Silas emerged. He had not dressed for war. He had not even brought a coat, just his boots, his breath, and whatever was in his chest that he hadn't yet learned to name. He walked slow. The snow parted like it didn't want to bother him. His hands stayed open at his sides. Abram called out behind him, low and angry. "Get back inside, boy." Silas didn't stop. He stepped between his father and Wakantal Elk and looked the old man in the eye. "She's alive," he said. "Barely. But she's alive because I gave her the blanket." The silence that followed swallowed even the wind. Wakan's eyes narrowed, not in judgment, but something deeper, appraisal, recognition. "What made you help her?" the elder asked. Silas's voice didn't shake. "Because she looked like someone who'd been seen last by wolves." And that, it seemed, was enough. Wakantal Elk nodded once. Then, without a word, he dropped to one knee. Behind him, up on the ridge, the watchers began to move. Not forward, not back, down. One by one, they dismounted. One by one, they knelt. No sound, no command, just the snow bending beneath them. Hundreds of men and women folding into the earth like they were planting something. From the porch, Abram's hands loosened on the rifle. From the doorway, Nettie raised her hand to her mouth. Inside the barn, Asha Redbird stepped forward. She walked slowly, wrapped in the patchwork quilt, her feet steady, her breath visible. Her face was drawn, but she held herself like someone who had remembered something sacred. She walked toward the man who had not come for war, and she fell, not from weakness, but into his arms. Wakan caught her, held her like someone who had once called her kin. Then rose. He turned without speaking and led her back toward the line. But just before she mounted, she looked over her shoulder. Her eyes met Silas's. There was no smile, no nod. But something passed between them like smoke through a chimney. Warm, brief, unforgettable. And then she was gone, riding silent among her people. They did not gallop. They did not shout. They simply turned. And as they disappeared behind the hills, the snow began to fall again. Soft, straight, without wind. The boy who had stood between two worlds remained where he was, boots buried ankle-deep, breath fogging in the cold. Abram came to stand beside him. Nettie joined them. None spoke. None needed to. From the ridge, the silence stayed behind. And far behind the barn, a new shape had appeared in the straw. A small wooden carving, eagle-winged and open-eyed, left without ceremony. And when Asha stepped out from the barn, her blanket trailing behind her like smoke, she did not fall. She walked toward her people, and did not vanish. The fever came quick, not from the cold outside, but the heat she'd carried too long beneath her skin. By the next morning, the ridge was empty again, but the world hadn't gone back to how it was. The silence had shifted. It no longer pressed like a weight. It hovered like a memory, just behind your shoulder, never quite seen, but always felt. The snow that followed came gently, but it stayed, blanketing the fence lines and the tracks the Comanche had left behind. Even the dogs barked softer now, like they too remembered the way the warriors had knelt. Nettie Greeley stirred the morning fire with her usual care, but there was something in her hands, slower, gentler, that hadn't been there a week before. Abram sat by the window, his rifle no longer on his lap but hanging over the mantel where it had once lived undisturbed. He still didn't talk much, but now when he watched the ridge, it was less with suspicion and more with something like thoughtfulness. He rubbed his thumb over the brass plate of an old medal he hadn't touched in years, one from a time before he knew what losing really meant. Silas had not spoken much either, though not out of silence. It was more like something inside him was unfolding in slow motion, too big for words, too sacred to rush. He'd been helping his father mend the porch rail when he felt it. Not a sound, not a sight, but a knowing. Something off-kilter. He turned, eyes drawn toward the barn, and his stomach dropped. She was there, again, curled on the straw, alone, her body shaking with a tremor that wasn't from cold, her breath too fast, too shallow. He ran before he could think. By the time he knelt beside her, her skin burned beneath his fingers. Her lips were cracked, dry, and when she tried to speak, only a whisper of breath escaped. She didn't need to say anything. He shouted, louder than he'd ever dared. Within moments, Nettie was there, skirts trailing through the snow. Abram followed, silent and grim. They didn't ask questions. They carried her inside. The parlor had never felt sacred before, but with Osha Redbird lying on the old cot, wrapped again in the patched quilt that had first saved her, the room transformed. Nettie drew the curtains to soften the light. Abram stoked the fire until it roared. Silas wiped her brow with a damp cloth, again and again, never looking away. "She shouldn't be burning up," Nettie murmured, holding a tin basin under her arm. "Not after being out in that cold. Not unless—" "She never finished healing," Silas said. Abram said nothing, but his eyes flicked toward the carving on the mantel, the eagle Asha had left without fanfare. It watched the room like a guardian made of memory and wood. The fever took hold that night, and with it came the dreams. She whispered in her sleep, words from her language, names Silas couldn't understand. Once she cried out, fingers clenching the air like she was reaching for something that had already died. Other times she mumbled what sounded like songs, lullabies full of minor notes and sharp edges. Silas stayed at her side, wiping sweat from her skin, whispering stories about things that didn't matter, how he once caught a frog with no legs, how his sister's name had been Esther, how the barn door always stuck in spring. None of it was important. All of it was true. By the second night, townsfolk began to arrive. Not many, and not all at once. First came old Mrs. Gorman with a jar of canned peaches and hands that trembled as she passed it through the open door. Then the Jackson boy, no older than 12, holding a cloth bundle of cornbread and muttering something about his mother not wanting it to go to waste. By sunset, 5 others had come. None stayed long. None asked questions. They just looked at the house like it was something new, something they hadn't believed could exist. Nettie said nothing each time, only nodded and placed the gifts near the fire. "She's halfway to the ridge again," she murmured late on the 3rd night. Silas nodded, his eyes never leaving Asha's face. "Why'd she come back?" Abram asked, voice low. Nettie didn't answer at first. Then, "Something stronger than cold, something unfinished." When the fever finally broke, it came with silence, a long stretch of it, the kind that made the tick of the mantel clock sound like thunder. Asha stirred beneath the blanket. Her lips parted. Her eyes opened slowly, catching the lamplight like polished stone. Silas was asleep in the chair beside her, knees drawn up, head tucked against his shoulder. She looked at him for a long time, then whispered, "Silas." His eyes opened immediately, like he'd been listening even in dreams. "You're back," he said. "I tried to leave," she whispered. "I know. But I kept seeing the way you looked at me," she added, "like I wasn't broken." "You weren't," he said, sitting upright. "I was." He shook his head. "Not to me." She reached for his hand. He didn't flinch. Her fingers were thin, still warm from fever, but stronger than they had been. "You shouldn't have followed me," she said. "I didn't," he replied. "I waited." Her breath caught. Why? Because sometimes people don't know they're allowed to stay. Nettie entered then, carrying a bowl of broth. She didn't speak, just smiled, set the bowl down gently, and touched Asha's shoulder with a kind of reverence she'd once only reserved for church. Outside, the snow had deepened, covering the world in a hush like cotton. The air smelled of smoke and something sweeter, maybe cinnamon, maybe hope. Abram stood at the window again that evening, arms crossed, eyes on the ridge. She shouldn't have come back, he muttered. But he didn't say it with anger, more like someone testing a thought. I'm glad she did, he added, quieter now. Behind him, Asha sat upright by the fire, cradling the bowl in her lap. Her eyes flicked toward Abram just briefly. She didn't speak, but he saw it. He nodded once and stepped away. Silas helped her shift closer to the flame. The firelight danced across her face, softening the lines illness had carved. Her eyes followed the flames for a while. I thought I had no place, she said. You do now. No one ever told me that before. I'm telling you now. She turned her head, met his gaze. Do you know what they used to call me when I was small? He shook his head. Little sky ghost. Said I wandered too much. Said the clouds whispered to me. Do they still? Not as much. Maybe they're waiting for you to listen again. She smiled. Faint. Real. The fire popped. Nettie hummed an old tune from the kitchen, and for the first time, it didn't sound like morning. Asha leaned her head back against the chair. I think I need to leave again, she said suddenly. Silas froze. Why? Because it's too much. Too much what? Being cared for, she said. I don't know how to be loved. I know how to survive. But love, it's loud. It's soft. It hurts. He stood slowly, stepped closer. Then stay until it stops hurting. Her eyes welled, but no tears fell. I can't promise that. You don't have to, he said. Just don't go before you're ready. She reached for his hand again. This time she held it longer. Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet and relentless, covering the land in something clean. The house stood like a lantern tucked in a fold of the hills, and inside it, for the first time in a long while, nothing felt broken. That night, the snow stopped, and for the first time, Silas heard her laugh, not like someone healed, but like someone beginning. A year later, they rebuilt the barn in cedar, but kept the eastern wall as it was, cracks and all. There were places on the prairie where wind always found a way in, no matter how tight the boards, how thick the stone, or how deep the silence. The barn, even rebuilt in fresh cedar, had one such place along the eastern wall, just beneath the rafters where morning light slipped through like old memory. It was there the cold came in, but no one patched it. Some things were meant to breathe. Spring had come late to Bridle Pass. The last snow had fallen 3 weeks ago and still clung in the hollows behind the ridge. The rest had melted slowly, feeding dry creeks and softening the earth that had frozen stiff for too many months. The fields near the Greeley homestead, once colorless, now bore a faint green mist of new growth. The trees bent less under the weight of sky. Even the dogs barked louder again, but not like before, not with fear, just with life. Asha Redbird stood in the doorway of the barn with a pail of clean water in one hand, and her hair braided down her back. Her posture was still cautious, but she no longer looked like she might vanish. She moved with the measured grace of someone who had chosen to be seen. That choice echoed in everything, in the way she accepted food now without reluctance, in the way she nodded thanks instead of whispering it like a ghost, in the way she watched Silas when he wasn't looking. He stood by the gate that morning, oiling the hinges on the new post Abram had sunk beside him. They didn't speak much when they worked. They didn't need to. What had begun as obligation had become rhythm. They passed tools back and forth with ease. Abram no longer double-checked every knot Silas tied, nor grunted at every mistake. And Silas, now nearly 15, moved like someone who understood what he carried, not just wood or wire, but responsibility. "You notice it too?" Abram asked, squinting toward the ridge. Silas followed his gaze. A cloud of dust on the far edge of the prairie. Wagons, not fast, not panicked. 17 of them, maybe more, strung out in a slow arc like a parade without music. "They're not here for fightin'," Silas said. "No," Abram muttered. "They're not." Nettie stepped onto the porch with a cloth bundle in her hands. Inside, still warm from the stove, was bread she'd baked that morning with the last of the flour. She handed it to Asha without a word. Asha took it, nodded. Their hands touched briefly. Neither pulled away. By mid-morning, the wagons reached the rise outside town. They did not come all the way in. Instead, the lead wagon, a flatbed with rough sides and a faded buffalo skin tied across the back, stopped near the Greeley gate. Wakan Tall Elk climbed down. He looked no older than before, but more tired, like someone who had carried a heavy piece across a long and narrow bridge. He paused near the barn door and looked toward Silas, who stood in the dust with his hands at his sides. "You walk straighter now," Wakan said, not smiling, but not cold. Silas nodded, still learning. The old man's eyes narrowed with quiet approval. "That means you are worth remembering." From inside the barn, Asha stepped forward. Her boots were worn at the toe. Her dress had been mended with new patches, stitched by Nettie's hand. She stood before Wakan, without bowing, without flinching. When she placed her hand against her chest and lowered her head slightly, it was not in submission, but in return. They spoke in words Silas could not understand, short phrases, old vowels, deeper than names, but their eyes spoke more than mouths ever could. Wakan placed one weathered hand on her shoulder, then looked to Silas. "The Comanche wished to make peace," he said, "not because we trusted, but because of what was done here." "I didn't do much," Silas said, almost ashamed. Wakan shook his head. "You lit a fire in the snow." Council began quietly. It did not take place in the church or at the saloon, but beneath the cottonwood near the barn, where the breeze could carry words that mattered. Some of the townsfolk came, not many. Some sat. Some stood back. No one shouted. No one drew arms. Not everyone agreed. There were mutters of old stories, of raided cattle, of graves still raw in memory. But no one left either. Not when Asha spoke. Her voice was soft, but it held shape, not pleading, but explaining. When she told them why she ran, why she stayed, why she came back, even the bitterest mouths fell still. By sunset, the fire had died low and the last words had been spoken. Nothing signed, but something settled. Later, after the wagons had begun to turn back toward the open plains, after the last of the horses had drunk from the creek and the cottonwood's shadow had lengthened, Silas returned to the barn. Asha stood there alone, staring east. "They said I can go back," she said. He stepped closer. "Do you want to?" "I don't know. You don't have to decide tonight." She looked at him then, and the question was in her eyes before it reached her mouth. "You gave me that." "What?" "The choice." He swallowed. "Then stay or go, but do it because it's yours now." She reached out, touched his cheek with fingers that had once trembled and now only lingered. "And if I stayed?" He didn't smile, just said, "Then I'd make sure the roof stops leaking." She laughed. Not a sound of glee, but something deeper, like water breaking through ice. That night, Abram hammered in the last board for the new barn gate, with Silas holding it steady. Neither spoke of the past, but their silence no longer hurt. It worked. Nettie stitched a second blanket, this one brighter. She didn't ask who it was for. Inside the barn, the eastern wall remained untouched, slatted and imperfect, with one crack that let in dawn. The eagle carving still hung on the beam, dust gathering on its wings. When Silas woke the next morning, she was there beside the fire, feeding it kindling, her back to the wind, her breath steady. She did not look ready to run. She looked ready to begin. And far across the ridge, where hooves once carved fear into the snow, the wind paused, as if listening for the boy who gave his only blanket. Some nights, when the wind moves just right across the open prairie, it carries with it the memory of things that never asked to be remembered, of footsteps left in snow, too soft to last, of songs hummed in the dark that never had words, of faces seen only once but never quite forgotten. Somewhere beyond Bridle Pass, where the cottonwoods still lean eastward like they're listening for someone's return, the land keeps its stories tucked between the fence lines and under the eaves of barns rebuilt by quiet hands. And if you stand in the right place, beneath the stars that once watched over silence and fire, you might feel it too, the hush of a truth that was never written down, but still found its shape in the way a woman stood tall after nearly dying, or the way a boy gave his only blanket not because he was told to, but because something inside him knew what being forgotten felt like. You might remember how the ridge held still, how the horses didn't flinch, how men who once carried rifles dropped to their knees not in surrender, but in reverence, and how a quilt stitched from grief became a bridge between two histories. There's a crack in the eastern wall of that barn still, just wide enough to let morning through, and they never did fix it. Some things, after all, are meant to remind us we survived. The fire that warmed her wasn't born of matches or oil. It was lit the moment one heart chose mercy over distance, and it burned soft and steady through fever, through fear, through every whispered prayer no one thought would be answered. Sometimes it isn't justice that rides in loudest, but the decision not to turn away. Sometimes the truest power lies not in guns or blood, but in staying, in handing over bread without being asked, in sitting beside someone who doesn't yet know if they're allowed to belong. The echo of hooves may fade, but the shape they carved into snow lingers long after, like shadows burned into memory. She never asked for a place to stay, only for the chance to decide. And when she laughed with her whole self at last, it wasn't because she was healed, but because she was finally becoming something of her own. The world didn't change that night with fire or banners, but with the way a town listened, the way a mother placed a second quilt by the fire without asking why, the way a father built a gate beside the son he once kept at arm's length. Wildflowers bloomed early that spring, clinging to the dry patches by the barn, not needing to be planted, just needing space. And the eagle carved in wood, its wings wide with memory, still hangs in the rafters where the wind pauses to bow. We don't always get the justice we want in the hour we want it, but the land remembers what men forget, and time has a way of folding kindness into legend. The forgotten woman might never stand in court or see her name carved in stone, but she saved something greater, a generation of silence unbroken, a lineage of small mercies, a new kind of courage that wears no badge but walks steady. And for those who ever wondered if a boy can grow taller just by standing up when no one else does, well, the ridge tells that story in the hush between dawn and saddle. We say honor can be buried, but it can't be erased. We say justice comes late, but it still matters. We say truth doesn't need a crowd, only one person to carry it. And maybe, just maybe, when we look back from wherever we're going, we'll remember the sound of a woman's voice rising again, the creak of cedar boards holding fast through storm, the smell of cornbread and saddle leather, and the boy who stood still long enough for the world to shift around him. If that story stirred something quiet in you, something aching or remembering, then leave behind a sign, won't you? A word, a whisper, a fire lit low. Let it be known you still believe in the slow work of goodness, in forgiveness that doesn't need to be earned, in old truths coming home with no banner, only footsteps. And if your heart leaned in to listen, even just a little, then consider joining us again. There are more stories like this, buried under dust and time, waiting to be told. Subscribe to our channel to hear the next one, where the wind still carries names no one ever carved on a headstone, and the light of old oil lamps still flickers just enough to read by.